Legionary. This video is the compendium of the first book of the Caesars de Bello Gallico, the Gallic Wars that Caesar began in 58 before Christ and concluded in annum 51 before Christ. Book 1 of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar describes the initial phase of the Gallic War, focusing on the defeat of the Helvetii and the confrontation with Ariovistus. This period is marked by Caesar's strategic mastery and the impressive Roman army logistics that enable the rapid deployment and success of his forces. Have fun. All Gaul is divided into three parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, those who in their own language are called Celts, in our Gauls, the third. All these differ from each other in language, customs, and laws. The river Garonne separates the Gauls from the Aquitani. The Marne and the Seine separate them from the Belgae. Of all these, the Belgae are the bravest, because they are farthest from the civilization and refinement of our province, and merchants least frequently resort to them, and import those things which tend to effeminate the mind. And they are the nearest to the Germans, who dwell beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually waging war, for which reason the Helvetii also surpass the rest of the Gauls in valor, as they contend with the Germans in almost daily battles, when they either repel them from their own territories, or themselves wage war on their frontiers. One part of these, which it has been said that the Gauls occupy, takes its beginning at the river Rhone. It is bounded by the river Garonne, the ocean, and the territories of the Belgae. It borders, too, on the side of the Sequani and the Helvetii, upon the river Rhine, and stretches toward the north. The Belgae rise from the extreme frontier of Gaul, extend to the lower part of the river Rhine, and look toward the north and the rising sun. Among the Helvetii, by far the most noble and wealthy was Origetorix. In the consulship of Marcus Messala and Publius Marcus Piso, driven by the desire for kingship, he stirred up a conspiracy among the nobility and persuaded the state to leave their territories with all their forces. It would be very easy, since they excelled everyone in courage, to gain control over the entire rule of Gaul. He persuaded them to this more easily because, on all sides, the Helvetii were confined by the natural features of the region. On one side, by the very wide and deep Rhine River, which separates the land of the Helvetii from the Germans. On the other side, by the very high Jura Mountains, which are between the Sequani and the Helvetii, and on the third side by Lake Geneva and the Rhone River, which separates our province from the Helvetii. These circumstances made it so that they wandered less widely and could less easily make war on their neighbors, which, from their perspective, caused great distress to men eager for battle. However, because of the multitude of people and the glory of war and bravery, they thought they had narrow boundaries, which extended 240 miles in length and 180 in width. Moved by these things and influenced by the authority of Origetorix, they decided to prepare those things which pertained to setting out, to buy up the greatest possible number of draft animals and wagons, to make the largest possible amount of seed, so that a supply of grain might be on the journey, to confirm peace and friendship with the neighboring states. For accomplishing these things, they judged 2 years to be sufficient for themselves. They confirmed the expedition by law for the third year. Origetorix was chosen to accomplish these things. He takes on a mission to the states. During this journey, he persuades Casticus, the son of Catamantiloides, a Sequanian, whose father had held the kingship among the Sequani for many years and had been called a friend by the Senate of the Roman people, to seize the kingship in his state, which his father had held before. Likewise, he persuades Dumnorix, a Haduan, the brother of Diviciacus, who at that time held the leadership in the state and was very acceptable to the common people, to attempt the same, and he gives him his own daughter in marriage. He proves to them that it would be very easy for them to accomplish their attempts because he himself, about to obtain the command of his own state, would support them with his forces and army. There was no doubt that the Helvetii were the most powerful in all of Gaul. He confirms that he would win kingdoms for them with his forces and army. Persuaded by this speech, they give each other their trust and an oath. and with the kingship seized, they hoped that they might gain control over all of Gaul through the three most powerful and firmest nations. This matter was disclosed to the Helvetii through an informer. According to their customs, they compelled Orgetorix to plead his case in chains. The penalty that followed a conviction was that he should be burned by fire. On the day appointed for the pleading of the case, Orgetorix gathered his whole household for the trial, about 10,000 people from all sides, and he also brought together all his clients and debtors, of whom he had a great number. Through them, he managed to avoid pleading his case. When the state, incited by this incident, tried to enforce its authority with arms, and the magistrates were collecting a multitude of people from the fields, Orgetorix died, and there is no lack of suspicion among the Helvetii that he himself brought about his own death. After his death, nevertheless, the Helvetii tried to carry out what they had decided, that is, to leave their territories. When they thought that they were now prepared for this undertaking, they burned all their towns, about 12 in number, and their villages, about 400, and the rest of their private buildings. They burn all the grain, except what they are about to carry with them, so that with the hope of a return home removed, they might be more ready to undergo all dangers. They order each person to bring out from his house a supply of processed food for 3 months. They persuade the Rorasi, the Tulindi, and the Letabrigi, their neighbors, to adopt the same plan, having used the same strategy, burning their towns and villages. Along with them, they set out. They also admit the Boii, who had dwelled beyond the Rhine, crossed into Noricum, and were besieging Nerea, as allies after they had been received back. There were altogether 2 routes by which they could leave their home. One through the Sequani, narrow and difficult, between Mount Jura and the Rhone River, where barely 1 wagon at a time could be led, and a very high mountain overhung, making it easy for very few to hinder them. The other through our province, much easier and more convenient, because the Rhone River flows between the territories of the Helvetii and the recently pacified Allobroges, and is fordable in several places. The last town of the Allobroges and the nearest to the borders of the Helvetii is Geneva. From that town, a bridge extends to the Helvetii. They thought they could either win over the Allobroges, as they seemed not yet well disposed toward the Roman people, or force them to allow them to go through their territories. After all things were prepared for the departure, they declare a day on which all should assemble at the bank of the Rhone. This day was the 5th day before the calends of April, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius. When it was reported to Caesar that they were attempting to march through our province, he hastened to depart from the city, and by the quickest possible routes, advanced into further Gaul, reaching Geneva. He ordered the maximum possible number of soldiers for the whole province. There was only 1 legion altogether in further Gaul, and commanded the bridge at Geneva to be cut down. When the Helvetii were informed about his arrival, they sent the most distinguished envoys of the state to him. Namius and Vericloetius held the chief position in this embassy. They were to say to him that they were inclined to make their journey through the province without causing any harm, because they had no other route. They requested that he grant them permission to do this according to his will. Caesar, because he remembered that Lucius Cassius, the consul, had been killed and his army routed and sent under the yoke by the Helvetii, did not think it should be granted.
Nor was he of opinion that men of hostile disposition, if an opportunity of marching through the province were given them, would abstain from outrage and mischief. Yet, in order that a period might intervene until the soldiers whom he had ordered to be furnished should assemble, he replied to the ambassadors that he would take time to deliberate. If they wanted anything, they might return on the day before the Ides of April.
Meanwhile, with the legion he had with him and the soldiers who had gathered from the province, Caesar constructs a wall and a trench of 18 miles in length from Lake Geneva, which flows into the Rhone River, to Mount Jura, which separates the territories of the Sequani from the Helvetii. With this work completed, he places garrisons, fortifies strongholds, so that, if they attempted to cross against his will, he could easily hinder them. When the day appointed for the pleading of the case arrived, and the envoys returned to him, He denies that he can allow them to march through the province according to the custom and example of the Roman people. He shows that, if they attempt to use force, they will be repelled. Disheartened by this prospect, the Helvetii, having constructed rafts and numerous boats joined together, some by the fords of the Rhone where the depth of the river was least, sometimes by day, more often by night, attempted to break through. They were repulsed by the fortification of the works, the concourse of soldiers, and the volleys of missiles in their attempt. The only route left was through the territory of the Sequani, where they could not go without their consent due to the narrowness of the passage. Unable to persuade them willingly, they send envoys to Dumnorix, a Haduan, so that by his intercession they might obtain permission from the Sequani. Dumnorix, who had great influence and power among the Sequani through favor and largesse, and was a friend to the Helvetii because he had married the daughter of Orgetorix from that state, and, driven by the desire for kingship, was eager for new developments and wanted as many states as possible bound to him by his favors, undertakes the matter. He persuades the Sequani to allow the Helvetii to pass through their territories, and he secures hostages to be exchanged between them, the Sequani, so that they would not hinder the Helvetii on their journey, and the Helvetii, so that they might pass without harm and injury. Caesar is informed that the Helvetii are intending to march through the territories of the Sequani and the Hedui, and they are ravaging their lands. The Hedui, unable to defend themselves and their possessions against them, send envoys to Caesar requesting aid. At the same time, the Hedui, Amberi, who were relatives and allies of the Hedui, informed Caesar that, with their fields devastated, they could not easily defend themselves from the violence of the enemy coming from the towns. Also, the Allobroges, who held villages and possessions beyond the Rhone, flee to Caesar and declare that, apart from their land, they have nothing left. Stirred by these reasons, Caesar decides not to wait until the Helvetii, having consumed all the resources of his allies, come into the territory of the Santones. The Arar is a river that flows through the territories of the Hedui and the Sequani into the Rhone, with incredible gentleness, so that it cannot be judged by the eyes in which direction it flows. The Helvetii were crossing it with boats and rafts joined together. When Caesar was informed by scouts that 3 parts of the Helvetian forces had already crossed that river, and only a 4th part remained on this side of the Arar, he set out from his camp at the 3rd watch with 3 legions to the part which had not yet crossed. Attacking them unexpectedly and unprepared, he cut down a great part of them. The rest threw themselves into flight and hid in the nearby woods. This tribe was called Tigurini, for the entire state of the Helvetii was divided into 4 tribes. This particular tribe, having departed from their home in the memory of our fathers, had killed the consul Lucius Cassius and had sent his army under the yoke. So, whether by chance or by the plan of the immortal gods, that part of the Helvetian state which had brought significant disaster upon the Roman people paid the penalty in the forefront. In this matter, Caesar avenged not only public but also private wrongs because the Tigurini had, in the same battle in which they killed Cassius, also killed his legate, Lucius Piso, grandfather of Piso, and exulted in the victory as insolently as if they had long endured the wrongs inflicted with impunity. After this battle, to be able to overtake the remaining forces of the Helvetii, he arranges for a bridge to be constructed on the Arar and crosses his army. The Helvetii, disturbed by his sudden arrival, realizing that what they had hardly achieved in 20 days, to cross the river, he had accomplished in 1 day, send envoys to him. Divico was the leader of this embassy, who had been the leader of the Helvetii in the war against Cassius. He engaged with Caesar as follows. If the Roman people made peace with the Helvetii, they would go into that region, and stay there where Caesar decided and wished. If he persevered in pursuing war, they should recall the old disaster of the Roman people and the ancient valor of the Helvetii. That having attacked unexpectedly that one tribe, when those who had crossed the river could not bring aid, he should not attribute great credit to his own valor or despise them. He had learned from his fathers and ancestors that they should strive more by bravery than by deceit or ambush. Therefore, He should not allow that place where they had established themselves to acquire a name or memory of the calamity of the Roman people and the destruction of an army. With this reply given, he withdrew. The next day, they moved their camp from that place. Caesar does the same, and he sends ahead all his cavalry, about 4,000 in number, which he had gathered from the entire province, and the Helvetii and their allies, to see in which direction the enemy was marching. Eagerly pursuing the rear guard of the enemy, they engage in battle unexpectedly at an inconvenient place with the Helvetian cavalry. A few of our men fall in that battle. When the Helvetii, having been raised by this battle, realized that 500 horsemen had driven off so great a multitude of horsemen, they begin to stand still more boldly, and, attacking the rear guard with the last division of their army, they often start a battle. Caesar cut his men from the battle, and he was satisfied at that time to hinder the enemy from ravaging, foraging, and plundering. In this manner, they traveled for about 15 days, with the last division of the enemy's army and our first division being no more than 5 or 6 miles apart. In the meantime, Caesar every day urgently demanded grain from the Helvetii, which they had publicly promised. For, due to the cold, as Gaul is situated to the north, as mentioned earlier, not only were the crops in the fields not ripe, but also there was not enough forage in sufficient quantity. Moreover, the grain which he had brought down the Saône River was less available, as the Helvetii had diverted him from the route by the Saône, from which he did not wish to depart. The Helvetii kept deferring the matter from day to day, saying that they were collecting, bringing together, and procuring it. When he perceived that he was being led on too long, and that the day was near on which grain was to be measured out to the soldiers, having summoned their leading men, of whom he had a great number in his camp, including Diviciacus and Liscus, who held the highest office among the Helvetii, whom they call the Virga Brevis, invested with annual power of life and death among them. He severely accused them because, when neither could nor should grain be bought, nor taken from the fields, it was not supplied to him at such a necessary time, especially since he, prompted by their prayers, had undertaken a war, and even more seriously, because he was deserted by them in time of need, though he, on their advice, had entered upon the war, and also because, when he knew that he was deserted and accused by their state, he had come under their protection and had brought his army into winter quarters to them. Then at last, Liscus, influenced by Caesar's speech, which he had previously kept secret, stated what he had in mind. There were some whose authority among the people was very great, who could privately accomplish more than the magistrates themselves. That these were discouraging the multitude by seditious and discreditable language from bringing in grain, which they ought not to, at such a necessary time and to such close neighbors, especially since they, in great part, had brought about the war at their own request. And even more seriously, that he was in need, deserted by them, because he no longer could bid as he liked against anyone when that man's leave was not obtained. By these means he had gained wealth, and had amassed great means to be used for largesses. Always to keep up a large body of cavalry at his own expense, and to have them around him, not only at home, but also among the neighboring states, to be able to liberally influence not only his own people, but even the neighboring states, and for the sake of this power to have given his mother in marriage among the Bituriges, to a man very noble and very powerful among them. To have married himself among the Helvetii, and to have married his sisters and daughters to men in other states. To favor and desire the Helvetii on account of this relationship, to hate even Caesar and the Romans, because by their coming his power had been diminished, and Diviciacus, his brother, had been restored to the ancient position of favor and honor. If anything should happen to the Romans, to be coming into the greatest hope of power through the Helvetii, not only to despair of the rule of the Roman people, but also of the influence which he holds, with respect to both power and favor. He had also learned in his inquiries that an equestrian battle had been fought a few days before against the Romans, the beginning of the flight from which was made by Dumnorix and his horsemen. For Dumnorix was in command of the cavalry, which the Helvetii had sent in aid of Caesar. Their flight had frightened the rest of the cavalry. With these things learned, since it appeared that the whole affair was turning out this way, and because he had led the Helvetii through the territories of the Sequani, because he had provided that hostages be given among them, because he had done all these things not only without his own order and without that of the state, but even without their knowing it, because he was accused by the magistrates of the Helvetii. He thought that there was sufficient cause for deciding either on him himself or on his state. The only thing he had against all these causes was that Diviciacus, his brother, was very devoted to the Roman people, and had the greatest influence and highest authority among them. For, lest he should offend his feelings, he did not venture anything against him or to order his state to do so. On the next day, when the matter was the same, since 2 days in all had passed, and as it seemed that the interval of time between the two crimes was small, he left the Helvetii and hastened to Bibracte, the town of the Helvetii, the largest and most powerful of all, not more than 18 miles from it. He thought that he must look out for the grain supply. So he turned aside from the Helvetii and hurried to Bibracte. The information about this was reported to the enemy by fugitives from the camp of Eld Aemilius, a Roman decurion of cavalry. The Helvetii, whether because they thought that the Romans were departing from them in terror, especially because they had not fought a battle the day before, when they had occupied higher positions, or whether because they thought that the matter of the grain supply could be cut off, changing their plan and their route, began to follow and harass our men who were marching in the rear. After the council was dismissed, the same leaders of the states who had previously been with Caesar returned to him and requested that they be allowed to confer with him privately about their own and everyone's safety. With this request granted, they all, weeping, prostrated themselves at Caesar's feet, declaring that they were striving no less to prevent what they had said from being disclosed than to obtain what they desired. This was because, if it were disclosed, they saw that they would bring the greatest torture upon themselves. Diviciacus the Aeduan spoke on their behalf, stating that there were two supreme powers in the whole of Gaul, one held by the Aedui, the other by the Arverni. These two, while contending for supremacy for many years, had come to the point where they hired Germans as mercenaries against each other. About 15,000 of these Germans had first crossed the Rhine, but once these savage and barbarous men had come to love the lands, culture, and resources of the Gauls, many more were brought over. Now there were in Gaul a total of about 120,000 of them. With these, the Aedui and their dependents had fought again and again in battles, suffering a great calamity, losing all their nobility, the entire Senate, and all their cavalry. Crushed by these battles and calamities, those who had previously held a prominent position in Gaul, through their own valor and the friendship and alliance with the Roman people, were forced to give the most noble of their fellow citizens as hostages to the Sequani, and to bind themselves by oath that they would neither demand the return of the hostages nor seek help from the Roman people, nor refuse to be under their rule and dominion forever. He claimed that he was the only one in the entire Aeduan state who could not be induced to take the oath or give his children as hostages. Because of this, he had fled from his state and come to Rome to the Senate, seeking help, since he alone was not bound by either oath or hostages. He argued that it was worse for the conquered Sequani than the defeated Aedui, because Ariovistus, the king of the Germans, had settled in their territories, had occupied the best third of Sequanian land, which was the finest in all of Gaul, and was now ordering the Sequani to depart from the other 2/3 of their territory, because a few months earlier, 24,000 men of the Herudes had come to him, for whom a place and settlement were being prepared. He predicted that in a few years, everyone would be driven out of the borders of Gaul, and all the Germans would cross the Rhine. For the Gallic land should not be compared with the Germanic soil, nor this way of life with that. But Ariovistus, once he had defeated the armies of the Gauls in battle, which had taken place at Magdeburg, imperiously and cruelly commanded, demanding the children of each noble as hostages and inflicting every kind of torture on them, if anything was not done at his command or according to his will. He was a barbarian, violent, and reckless, and his rule could not be sustained for long. Unless Caesar and the Roman people came to their aid, the same thing would have to be done by all the Gauls that the Helvetii had done, to migrate from their homes, seek a different dwelling, different settlements far from the Germans and try their luck in whatever way it happened. If these things were reported to Ariovistus, he had no doubt that he would inflict the severest punishment on all the hostages with him. He stated that Caesar could deter him, either by his own authority and army, or by the recent victory, or by the name of the Roman people, from leading a greater multitude of Germans across the Rhine and protect all Gaul from the aggression of Ariovistus. After this speech delivered by Diviciacus, all those who were present began to implore Caesar for help with great weeping. Caesar noticed that only a few Sequani, unlike the others, were not engaged in the usual actions, but were looking downcast at the ground. Wondering about the cause of this, he inquired directly from them. The Sequani replied with silence, remaining quiet in the same sorrow. Diviciacus, the Heduan, spoke for them. The Sequani were in a more wretched and grievous condition than the others because they alone dared not to complain or implore assistance even in secret, fearing the cruelty of Ariovistus as if he were present. This was due to the fact that, although others had the option to flee, the Sequani, having received Ariovistus within their borders, with all their towns under his control, were compelled to endure all tortures. Caesar, upon understanding these circumstances, strengthened the spirits of the Gauls with his words and promised to take care of the matter, assuring them that he had great hope Ariovistus would cease his injustices influenced by both his kindness and authority. After this speech, he dismissed the assembly. Many factors prompted him to consider and undertake this matter, especially the fact that he saw the Hedui, often called brothers and kinsmen by the Senate, being held in servitude and under the dominion of the Germans. This he deemed as a disgrace both to himself and to the Roman Republic in such a vast domain. Moreover, he perceived the gradual habit of the Germans crossing the Rhine and bringing a large multitude into Gaul, which he considered dangerous to the Roman people. He believed that these fierce and barbarous people would not be restrained, and once they had occupied all of Gaul, they might follow the example of the Cimbri and Teutones and march into the province and from there into Italy, especially since the Rhone separated the Sequani from the province. He thought it necessary to confront this situation as soon as possible. However, Ariovistus had assumed such haughty and arrogant attitudes that he seemed unbearable. Therefore, Caesar decided to send envoys to Ariovistus, asking him to choose a place for a meeting that would be convenient for both parties, expressing his desire to discuss important matters concerning both of them. Ariovistus replied to the envoys, stating that if he needed anything from Caesar, he would have gone to him, and if Caesar wanted anything from him, he should come to him. He also mentioned that he did not dare to come to the parts of Gaul controlled by Caesar without an army or to gather his forces without considerable supplies and effort. Additionally, he found it strange why the affairs of his Gaul, which he had won in war, should concern Caesar or the Roman people at all. After receiving these responses, Caesar sent envoys to Ariovistus again with the following instructions. Since he had enjoyed such great benefits from both him and the Roman people, being acknowledged as king and friend during his consulship, Ariovistus should not hesitate to come to a meeting when invited. Caesar outlined his demands. Firstly, Ariovistus should not bring any more multitude of people across the Rhine into Gaul. Secondly, he should return the hostages he had from the Hedui and allow the Sequani to return the hostages they held willingly. And finally, he should neither harm the Hedui unjustly nor make war on them or their allies. If Ariovistus complied, Caesar assured him and the Roman people of lasting goodwill and friendship. If not, he declared that, since the Senate, during the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, had resolved that whoever controlled the province of Gaul could use it to the advantage of the Republic, he would defend the Hedui and other friends of the Roman people. He warned that he would not ignore any wrongs done to the Hedui. In response, Ariovistus declared that the right of war allowed the victors to dictate terms to the vanquished. Similarly, he argued that the Roman people, when victorious, were accustomed to dictate not by another's prescription, but by their own judgment. He considered the Hedui to be tributaries to him, as they had attempted war clashed in arms, and were defeated. Ariovistus considered it a great injustice for Caesar, upon his arrival, to make the tributes worse for him. He declared that he would not return the hostages to the Aedui or to their allies, and he would not make war unjustly on them unless they remained in the conditions stipulated, paying the annual tribute. If they did not comply, the fraternal name of the Roman people would soon be absent for them. As for Caesar's threat not to ignore wrongs done to the Aedui, Ariovistus argued that no one had contested with him without suffering harm. He invited Caesar to engage in a confrontation and understand the courage of invincible Germans who, seasoned in war, had not lived under a roof for 14 years. At the same time, these instructions were being reported to Caesar. Envoys from the Aedui and the Treveri arrived. The Aedui complained that the Herudes, who had recently been brought into Gaul, were ravaging their lands and that they had not been able to purchase peace from Ariovistus even by giving hostages. The Treveri reported that 100 cantons of the Suebi had settled on the banks of the Rhine and were attempting to cross into their territory, led by the brothers Nashua and Symbarius. These developments deeply disturbed Caesar, and he considered it necessary to act quickly to prevent the possibility of a new force of Suebi joining with Ariovistus's existing troops, which would make it much harder to resist them. Therefore, he quickly gathered supplies and set out towards Ariovistus with forced marches. After marching for 3 days, he received news that Ariovistus with all his forces was heading to occupy Vesantio, the largest town of the Sequani, and that he had advanced 3 days' march from his own territory. Caesar believed he had to take precautions to prevent this from happening. Vesantio was well stocked with all kinds of supplies useful for war, and its natural fortifications provided a significant advantage. The town was almost entirely surrounded by the river Doubs, which curved around it like a compass, and the remaining space, not more than 1,600 feet where the river did not cover, was enclosed by a high mountain, whose roots extended to the riverbanks on both sides. A wall surrounding this mountain formed a citadel that connected with the town. Caesar hurried to the town with forced marches day and night, occupied it, and stationed a garrison there. While he stayed at Vesantio for a few days to arrange for supplies and provisions, reports from his men and the words of Gauls and merchants revealed that the Germans were of enormous stature, incredible bravery, and extraordinary skill in arms. They claimed that they often encountered the Germans and could not even withstand their gaze or the glare of their eyes. Suddenly, a great fear seized the entire army, causing no small disturbance in their minds and spirits. This fear first arose among the tribunes of the soldiers, the prefects, and others, who, out of personal friendship, had followed Caesar from the city but had little experience in military affairs. Each of these individuals presented various reasons they deemed necessary for their departure, requesting permission to leave, while some, driven by shame to avoid suspicion of fear, stayed behind. These individuals could neither mask their expressions nor sometimes hold back their tears. They hid in their tents, either lamenting their fate or mourning the shared danger with their friends. Throughout the camp, wills were being sealed. The words and fear of these individuals gradually disturbed even those who had considerable experience in the camp, including soldiers, centurions, and cavalry commanders. Those who wanted to be considered less fearful claimed they did not fear the enemy, but the narrowness of the journey and the vastness of the forests between them and Ariovistus, or worried about the food supply being adequately transported. Some even informed Caesar that when he ordered the camp to move and the standards to be carried, the soldiers would not obey due to their fear and would not carry the standards. Observing this, Caesar convened a council with all the centurions of every rank and severely reprimanded them. First, he criticized them for considering or asking into which part or by what plan they were being led. He reminded them that Ariovistus, during his consulship, had eagerly sought the friendship of the Roman people. Why would anyone now judge that he would depart from duty so recklessly? Caesar assured them that, with his demands known and the fairness of the conditions understood, Ariovistus would neither reject his nor the Roman people's goodwill. But if, driven by madness and fury, he waged war, why should they fear? Why should they despair of their own valor or Caesar's diligence? They had tested the enemy during their father's memory, when C. Marius had driven back the Cimbri and Teutones, and the army seemed to deserve no less credit than the commander himself. They had also recently fought in Italy against the rebellious slaves, who had been aided by some use and discipline they had received from the Romans. From this, they could judge the advantage of steadfastness, as they had feared those who had been unarmed for a long time without reason, and later defeated them armed and victorious. Finally, the same Germans, often encountered by the Helvetii, had been defeated not only in their own lands, but also in the lands of the Germans. Yet they had not been equal to our army. If the recent defeat of the Gauls and their flight disturbed them, they could discover that Ariovistus, after a prolonged war, had attacked the Gauls when they were exhausted by long campaigns, desperate for battle, and dispersed, and had won more by strategy and planning than by bravery. While this approach might have worked against barbarians and inexperienced men, Caesar did not believe it could ensnare the Roman armies. Those who attributed their fear to concerns over the food supply or the narrow passages acted arrogantly, doubting the general's duty or presuming to dictate it. Caesar assured them he had taken care of these matters. The Sequani, Luci, and Lingons were providing grain, and the crops were now ripe in the fields. They would soon judge the route for themselves. As for the claim that the soldiers would not follow orders or carry the standards, he was not troubled. He knew that any army that disobeyed orders either did so due to misfortune or was convicted of some crime of greed. His own unblemished life and his success in the Helvetian War testified to his integrity and good fortune. Therefore, he would move the camp during the fourth watch of the next night to see whether shame and duty or fear held more power. And if no one else followed, he would still go with only the 10th Legion, in which he had full confidence and which he would consider his personal guard. Caesar had particularly favored this legion and trusted in their valor the most. After this speech was given, the mindset of everyone was remarkably transformed, and a great enthusiasm and eagerness for waging war arose. The 10th Legion, through their tribunes, thanked Caesar for having such a high opinion of them, and assured him that they were ready and prepared to fight. Then the other legions approached the tribunes and centurions of the first ranks, expressing their desire to assure Caesar that they had never doubted or feared, and that they believed the decision on the war's outcome was the general's responsibility, not theirs. With their reassurance accepted and a route explored through Diviciacus, whom he trusted greatly among the Gauls, Caesar planned to lead the army through a longer but open route of more than 50 miles. As he had said, he set out at the fourth watch. On the 7th day of continuous march, scouts informed him that Ariovistus's forces were only 24 miles from his own. Upon learning of Caesar's approach, Ariovistus sent envoys to him, stating that the meeting Caesar had previously requested could now take place since he had come closer and deemed it safe to do so. Caesar accepted the proposal, thinking that Ariovistus was coming to his senses as he was now willing to meet voluntarily, something he had previously refused. Caesar hoped that, knowing the considerable benefits he and the Roman people had bestowed upon him, Ariovistus would cease his obstinacy. The meeting was scheduled for the 5th day from then. Meanwhile, as envoys were frequently sent back and forth, Ariovistus requested that Caesar not bring any infantry to the meeting, expressing fear of being surrounded by an ambush. He proposed that both parties come with cavalry only. Caesar, unwilling to cancel the meeting and also not trusting his safety to the Gallic cavalry, decided to dismount the Gallic horsemen and place soldiers of the 10th Legion, in whom he had the utmost confidence, on their horses, so that he would have the most reliable guard if anything required action. This arrangement led to a joke among the soldiers of the 10th Legion that Caesar was doing more than he had promised, for he had promised to treat them as his praetorian cohort, but was now having them serve as mounted troops. There was a large plain, and in it a sizable mound of earth. This place was about equally distant from both Ariovistus's and Caesar's camps. As agreed, they came to the meeting. Caesar stationed the legion he had brought on horseback about 200 paces from the mount. Ariovistus did the same with his cavalry at an equal distance. Ariovistus requested that they talk on horseback and each bring only 10 men to the meeting besides themselves. When they met there, Caesar began by recounting the benefits he and the Senate had bestowed upon Ariovistus, reminding him that he had been called a king by the Senate, made a friend, and received generous gifts. He emphasized that such honors were rarely bestowed and only for significant acts of service. Caesar pointed out that Ariovistus had gained these rewards through the goodwill and generosity of himself and the Senate, despite having no legitimate claim or reason to demand them. He also explained the ancient and justified bonds of friendship between the Romans and the Aedui, detailing how often and honorably the Senate had supported them, ensuring their supremacy in Gaul even before seeking Roman friendship. The Roman people's custom was to strengthen allies and friends, enhancing their status, dignity, and honor. Therefore, how could they allow anything brought into their friendship to be taken from them? Caesar then demanded the same terms he had given to the envoys: that Ariovistus neither wage war on the Aedui nor their allies, return the hostages, and, if he could not send any part of the Germans back home, at least prevent any more from crossing the Rhine. Ariovistus replied briefly to Caesar's demands, but spoke at length about his own merits. He stated that he had crossed the Rhine not by his own will, but at the request and invitation of the Gauls, having left home and family with great hopes and rewards. He had been given land in Gaul by the Gauls themselves, received hostages by their own will, and was taking tribute by the right of war, which victors usually impose on the vanquished. He argued that it was the Gauls who had waged war on him, not the other way around, as all the states of Gaul had come to attack him and camped against him. He had defeated them all in a single battle. If they wanted to try again, he was ready to fight. If they wanted peace, it was unjust to refuse the tribute they had voluntarily paid up to that point. He stated that the friendship of the Roman people should be an honor and protection, not a detriment, and he had sought it with this expectation. If the Romans wanted to relieve him of the tribute and the surrendered peoples, he would gladly renounce the Roman people's friendship as he had sought it. He said he was bringing more Germans into Gaul to protect himself, not to attack Gaul, and he had only come at the Gauls' request and had defended himself, not initiated the war. He claimed he had arrived in Gaul before the Romans and had never seen a Roman army in Gaul before this. What did Caesar want? Why was he coming into his possessions? Gaul was his province, just as Rome had theirs. He argued that just as it would be unfair for him to invade Roman territory, it was equally unfair for the Romans to interfere with his rights. He scoffed at the Aedui being called brothers by the Senate, stating that they neither helped the Romans in the last war with the Allobroges nor received assistance from the Romans in their conflicts with the Sequani. He suspected Caesar of having an army in Gaul to crush him under the guise of friendship. He warned that if Caesar did not withdraw his army from these regions, he would consider him an enemy, not a friend. He added that killing Caesar would earn him great favor from many Roman nobles and leaders, whose goodwill and friendship he could secure with Caesar's death. However, if Caesar left and handed Gaul over to him, he would reward him richly and undertake any wars Caesar wanted without any effort or risk on Caesar's part. Many arguments were made by Caesar to show why he could not abandon the undertaking. Neither his nor the Roman people's custom allowed for abandoning allies who had served them well. Nor did he believe that Gaul should belong to Ariovistus rather than the Roman people. The Arverni and the Ruteni had been conquered in war by Quintus Fabius Maximus, but the Roman people had pardoned them, neither incorporating them into the province nor imposing a tribute. If the most ancient times were to be considered, the Roman people had the most justified claim to rule in Gaul. If the judgment of the Senate was to be respected, Gaul ought to be free, as the Senate had declared it free to use its own laws after it was conquered in war. While these matters were being discussed in the meeting, Caesar was informed that Ariovistus's cavalry was approaching the hill and riding up to his men, throwing stones and weapons at them. Caesar immediately ended the meeting and returned to his men, ordering them not to retaliate in any way against the enemy. Although he saw that a battle between his selected legion and the cavalry would have involved no danger, he did not want it to be said that the enemy had been ambushed under the pretext of a conference. After it became known among the soldiers how arrogantly Ariovistus had behaved during the conference, forbidding all of Gaul to the Romans, and how his cavalry had attacked Caesar's men and disrupted the meeting, the soldiers were filled with much greater eagerness and enthusiasm for fighting. 2 days later, Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar, stating that he wished to discuss the matters that had been started but not completed between them. He proposed either setting another date for a meeting or, if Caesar preferred, sending one of his own legates to him. Caesar saw no reason for another meeting, especially since the Germans had been unable to restrain themselves from throwing weapons at his men the day before. He believed that sending one of his own men to Ariovistus would be too dangerous and expose them to wild and savage people. He thought it best to send Gaius Valerius Procillus, the son of Gaius Valerius Caparus, a young man of great courage and character, whose father had been granted Roman citizenship by Gaius Valerius Flaccus, and who was fluent in the Gallic language, which Ariovistus used frequently. There was no reason for the Germans to harm Procillus, and he sent Marcus Medius, who was a guest of Ariovistus, along with him. He instructed them to find out what Ariovistus wanted and report back to him. When Ariovistus saw them in his camp, he shouted in front of his army, asking why they had come, whether it was to spy on him. He did not allow them to speak and threw them in chains. On the same day, Ariovistus moved his camp and set up 6 miles from Caesar's camp at the foot of a mountain. The next day, he led his forces past Caesar's camp and set up camp 2 miles beyond it, intending to cut Caesar off from supplies and provisions coming from the Sequani and Aedui. From that day on, Caesar led his troops out of the camp daily, forming them into a battle line, offering Ariovistus the opportunity to fight if he wished. Ariovistus, however, kept his army in the camp for several days, engaging only in cavalry skirmishes each day. The type of combat the Germans practiced was this. There were 6,000 cavalry, and an equal number of the fastest and bravest foot soldiers, each selected by one of the cavalry for their protection. These foot soldiers fought among the cavalry, and the horsemen would retreat to them if needed. If any horseman was wounded or fell, they would surround and protect him. If they needed to advance further or retreat quickly, these foot soldiers, holding on to the horses' manes, could match the horses' speed. When Caesar saw that Ariovistus was keeping to his camp to avoid being cut off from supplies for too long, he moved his camp past Ariovistus's position, about 600 paces away, and chose a suitable place for a new camp. He formed his army into 3 lines, with the first and second lines ready to fight, and ordered the third line to fortify the camp. Ariovistus sent about 16,000 light-armed soldiers and all his cavalry to scare Caesar's men and prevent them from fortifying the camp. Nevertheless, Caesar continued with his plan, ordering the first 2 lines to repel the enemy and the third to complete the fortifications. After fortifying the camp, he left 2 legions and part of the auxiliaries there and took the remaining 4 legions back to the main camp. The next day, following his usual practice, Caesar led his troops out of both camps and drew them up a short distance from the main camp, offering the enemy battle. When he saw that they did not come out even then, he led his army back to camp around noon. Ariovistus then sent part of his forces to attack the smaller camp. A fierce battle was fought until evening, with many wounds inflicted and received on both sides. At sunset, Ariovistus withdrew his troops to camp. When Caesar questioned the captives about why Ariovistus had not fought a decisive battle, he learned that the Germans had a custom where their matrons would decide by lots and prophecies whether or not it was advantageous to engage in battle. They had declared that it was not fated for the Germans to win if they fought before the new moon. The next day, Caesar left a suitable garrison in both camps and drew up all the auxiliaries in front of the smaller camp for the enemy to see, using the auxiliaries to give the appearance of greater numbers since he was outnumbered by the enemy. He himself led his army in 3 lines to the enemy camp. The Germans had no choice but to bring out their troops and draw them up in tribal units, evenly spaced. The Harudes, Marcomanni, Tribosi, Vangians, Nemets, Seduzzi, and Suebi, surrounding their entire line with wagons and carts to leave no hope of escape. They placed their women on these wagons, who, with outstretched hands and tears, begged the soldiers not to hand them over to Roman slavery. Caesar appointed a legate and a quaestor to each legion, ensuring they had witnesses to their valor. He himself began the battle from the right wing, which he perceived as the weakest part of the enemy line. Our men made a fierce attack on the enemy when the signal was given, and the enemy quickly charged, leaving no room for throwing javelins. So they abandoned their javelins and fought with swords at close quarters. The Germans quickly formed a phalanx and withstood the attack of the swords. Several of our soldiers leaped onto the phalanx, grabbed the enemy's shields with their hands, and wounded them from above. When the enemy line was pushed back and put to flight from the left wing, they still pressed heavily against our line on the right with their superior numbers. Publius Crassus, a young man commanding the cavalry, noticed this, and being more agile than those engaged in the line, sent the third line to assist our struggling troops. Thus, the battle was restored, and all the enemies turned and fled, not stopping until they reached the Rhine, about 50 miles from the battlefield. Very few, trusting in their strength, tried to swim across or found rafts and saved themselves. Among these was Ariovistus, who found a small boat tied to the riverbank and escaped in it. Our cavalry pursued and killed the rest. Ariovistus had 2 wives, one a Suebian, whom he had brought from home, and the other a Norican, the sister of King Voccio, whom he had married in Gaul. Both died in the flight. He also had 2 daughters, one of whom was killed, and the other captured. Gaius Valerius Procillus, while being dragged by his guards in chains during the flight, encountered Caesar himself as he was pursuing the enemy with his cavalry. This event brought Caesar as much joy as the victory itself, seeing this honorable man of the province of Gaul, his friend and guest, rescued from the enemy and restored to him. Fortune had not diminished his joy and gratitude in this matter. Procillus said that 3 times in his presence, lots were cast to decide whether he would be immediately burned alive or spared for another time. The lots had spared him. Marcus Medius was also found and brought back to Caesar. With news of this battle being reported across the Rhine, the Suebi, who had come to the banks of the Rhine, began to return home. When those who lived nearest to the Rhine sensed that they were terrified, they pursued them and killed a great number of them. Caesar, having completed 2 major wars in one summer, led his army into winter quarters among the Sequani a little earlier than the season required. He put Labienus in charge of the winter quarters and then set out for Cisalpine Gaul to hold court sessions. Thank you for watching this video. You definitively enjoyed it. Therefore, leave a like, please. He'd assure you are looking forward to see the next compendium. Subscribe to the channel for more videos and more of Caesar's adventures. He will see you, Legionary.